future.
Gentleman's time has expired. And now yield 5 minutes to the gentlewoman from California, Congresswoman Watson.
Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Bernanke, for coming here. I'm going to give you a series of events, and I'll give you a list of questions. You can answer them all together. First, despite the fact that the plan for a merger was announced on September 15th of 2008, there was no mention of the $20 billion capital injection from the government until January the 16th. At what point during the negotiations between Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, and the federal government was it determined that this money would be necessary for the merger to be finalized? And then, given that as of January 16th, Merrill Lynch's projected losses for the fourth quarter were approximately $15.3 billion, how is the sum of the $20 billion agreed upon? And finally, in this set of questions, to date, how much of this money has been drawn down, and how has it been used?
Well, at the time that Merrill Lynch and Bank of America initially announced their merger agreement in the middle of September, this was before the Congress had passed the TARP law, and so there had been at that time, no capital injection and no expectation of capital injection. Both Merrill Lynch and Bank of America received capital in the middle of October during the intense phase of the banking crisis. An additional $20 billion was injected, as you say, in January 16th. That was based on a review of what the supervisors and the other experts at the Federal Reserve believed would be sufficient to reassure the market that Bank of America would be stable going forward. They have used that capital to support their activities, including lending, and they, of course, are repaying the government dividends. They hope to repay at least part of the TARP in the future.
I'm sure this might be the experience in other members' offices. I represent a district out in Los Angeles, and we get calls every day, up to 10 and 30 calls of people who have gone to the bank and they're not having their loans restructured. And I'm very curious about where that money went when it went into the system. It's like trying to unscramble eggs. But I know the consumers and the owners of property are not being assisted with refinancing their loans. Let me go on. In testimony before the committee on June 11th, Bank of America CEO Ken Lewis claimed that the revelation of a $12 billion loss at Merrill Lynch on December 14th of 2008 caused him to consider invoking the Material Adverse Effect Clause, or referred to as MAC, to back out of the deal 9 days after shareholders had voted to approve the acquisition. However, in an email on December the 19th, the bank supervision officer of the New York Fed, Tim Clark, stated that Lewis's claim that they were surprised by the rapid growth of the losses seems somewhat suspect. Chairman Bernanke, given that shortly after the deal was announced in September, Bank of America has installed 200 people at Merrill Lynch to thoroughly review their books, and do you believe Mr. Lewis was honestly surprised by the acceleration of losses?
I have no way of knowing. We did have concerns about the quality of the due diligence, but I have no direct evidence that he was in fact informed about the losses.
Well, 200 people were installed at Merrill Lynch, so that seems like they were going to dig very deeply. You know, somewhere the due diligence kind of fizzled out. And I just think that Bank of America's due diligence was not as thorough as it should be. Do you believe that there were insights into Merrill Lynch's books that the government had that Bank of America did not?
I can't answer that with certainty. We would have had some information about Merrill Lynch because we were working with the SEC to supervise it after we began lending to investment banks. But I don't think that we had knowledge of the size of losses either. I'm quite sure we did not.
All right, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to try to make another statement and questions, and if the time runs out, I would ask Mr. Bernanke to give me his answers in writing. Okay. In an email on December the 20th, the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, Jeffrey Lacker, described a telephone conversation with you where you expressed the belief that the MAC threat is irrelevant because it's not credible, and that you plan to make it even more clear that if they play that card and then need assistance, management is gone. So do you remember the phone call with Mr. Lacker that the email was referring to, and do you believe that Mr. Lewis's claim that he would invoke the MAC and back out of the deal were credible? And had the Bank of America decided not to complete the merger, would the Fed have pursued the removal of their management and board, and had the Fed ever taken action to remove the management of a private entity before? Do your best. And
I was concerned initially about whether this was a serious proposal to invoke the MAC, because I did believe that it would be very detrimental to the Bank of America as well as to the financial system. I never made any threat to Mr. Lewis regarding removing the board and the management. One example of where the Federal Reserve removed a management was in the case of AIG, where there was an agreement that the CEO would be replaced upon the acquisition, upon the consummation of the loan we made to stabilize that company.
The gentlewoman's time has expired.